Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour, bienvenue. Bienvenue si vous nous rejoignez dans l'amphithéâtre Foch. Cet après-midi, nous allons donc poursuivre notre réflexion autour de ce thème, souveraineté, alliance et partenariat. Le constat est clair, l'autonomie stratégique d'un pays réside dans sa capacité d'innovation. Et le temps d'avance technologique, d'ailleurs, redéfinit non seulement les rapports de force, mais devient aussi parfois une condition des capacités d'engagement. Dans cette compétition technologique mondiale, la sécurisation des ressources stratégiques est un enjeu essentiel, vous le savez, et en particulier celle des minéraux critiques, que ce soit le zinc, le graphite, le cuivre, le lithium, les terres rares, ou que ce soit le Groenland, l'archipel du Svalbard ou encore le passage du Grand Nord. Ces territoires abritent dans leur sous-sol un immense trésor et attise évidemment les convoitises et particulièrement celle du président américain. Ça a été évoqué ce matin en plénière. C'est un contexte qui redéfinit complètement la souveraineté territoriale dans le Grand Nord. Et pour en parler, je vous propose tout de suite d'accueillir notre prochain panel en introduction, Théodora Morosanou du Forum de défense et de stratégie. Merci de l'accueillir chaleureusement.
Thank you for this introduction. On behalf of the Defense and Strategy Forum, I have the pleasure to introduce the first roundtable entitled Defending Territorial Sovereignty and Securing Strategic Researches in the Arctic Region. This roundtable is actually part of the French-Canadian Young Leaders Program on Defense and Diplomacy Issues, a joint initiative of the Forum of Defense and Strategy and France-Canada Association, reuniting 12 exceptional profiles that we have over there and over here. They are under the age of 40 and they come from diplomatic, military, academic, and industrial and political circles. And this roundtable will be moderated by Dr. Ulrike Franke. She is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, based in the Paris office, and I would like her to join us with the others in the next moments. Her areas of focus include German and European security and defense, the future of warfare and the impact of new technologies such as drones and AI on geopolitics and warfare. Franke has published widely on these and other topics and regularly appears as a commentator in the media. She co-hosts a German-language podcast on security and defense and is also a member of the French collimateur Le Casque et la Plume podcast team. She holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Oxford, and in her thesis, she studied the use of drones by Western armed forces. She also holds a bachelor degree from Sciences Po Paris and a double master degree from Sciences Po Paris and the University of St. Gallen. Franke is a policy affiliate of GovAI and teaches at Sciences Po Paris. We also have to thank our partners, the Association France-Canada, the Robert Schuman Foundation, Women International Security Germany, CAE, and GDES. So please enjoy this roundtable, and I invite all our speakers and our moderator to take their places. Thank you.
Right, a wonderful good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this discussion on defending territorial sovereignty and securing strategic resources in the Arctic region. As you can hear, we're going to do this in English, and I think all of our speakers are going to speak in English, unless I'm mistaken, so you may not need the translation for this session. I mean, at this point, almost all the panels that are happening today here in parallel are very topical and there's something happening all over the world. But that being said, it does feel like the region we're going to talk about has been in the news quite a bit lately, or at least more so than, 5 or 10 years ago. Obviously, the kind of elephant in the room when you talk about the Arctic or Le Grand Nord, I think as it was put in French, is the question of Greenland and the NATO transatlantic scandal we just had, and to some extent have overcome, but not really, on US ambitions over Greenland and over, taking over sovereignty of Greenland. So I'm sure this is one of the topics we're going to touch upon today, and I invite the speakers obviously to say something about that. But there's also obviously the issue of climate change and how that influences the region as it looks like today versus how it's going to look like in 5, in 10, in 15 years' time. Securing strategic resources is a topic that is mentioned even in the title already, and something that needs to be discussed. And I'd actually also be quite interested in talking about the role of other players in the region, because as you may remember, part of Donald Trump's logic of even talking about Greenland beyond his interest in just having more land was and is that there is supposedly a lot of influence and a growing influence by actors like Russia and China. And so I guess this is something that we can also discuss. But you're not here to listen to me. We want to hear from the people involved and concerned. So I have an all-star cast with me here today. We are unfortunately missing a US American, which I think would have been fun, but we don't have that, but we do have, I guess, representatives, it's largely correct, from Canada, from Denmark, from France, obviously, and from Sweden. I'm just gonna present the speakers real quick before we start with initial statements. I know that you have been invited to give initial statements, and I think that's great, but I would love to keep this as conversational as is humanly possible with a panel of 5. I think that's quite the ask. But if you could try to keep it short and obviously interesting and engaging, I'm sure that you can do. And ideally, I'd love to kind of move to questions also as fast as I can. So if there are pressing questions from the audience, please feel free to immediately make yourself known after the initial statements. Otherwise, we'll do a little bit of a discussion here. But let me present this indeed all-star cast that I have next to me, and I think they're sitting nicely in the order of how they are listed in the program as well. So we've got Colonel Jason Galuga from Canada, the defense attaché here in France. We've got Pascal Joannin, the Director General of the Robert Schuman Foundation, who I'm sure is going to share some European and EU views on the whole situation. We got Henrik Breitenbauch from the Royal Danish Defence College, indeed the Dean of the Royal Danish Defence College. We've got David Béard from the Foreign Ministry, from CAPS, the Directeur Adjoint du CAPS, which, okay, can I do this? Le Centre d'Analyse Politique et Stratégique? De prévision, pardon, et stratégie, donc, ou stratégique. After 3 years in France, I still don't get this right. And last but certainly not least, we've got Caroline Vicini, who is the ambassador of Sweden to France. Okay, you two changed seats, but that's okay. And so as you can see, we do have some of the countries involved in the regions who are going to share with us their views on, what the main issues are, what their country's main concerns are, and anything else really that you wanna share. So, if I may, I'm gonna pass over to you right away, and thanks for being here.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Fellow panelists, Dr. Franke, thank you so much for having me here representing Canada. The panel we're talking about as we discuss territorial sovereignty as one of the main themes and strategic resources in the High North. We really have to ground our conversation in the harsh reality in which we find ourselves right now in 2026. Our Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, stated in Davos that we are in the midst of a geopolitical rupture. And the pleasant fictions of the Cold War era that economic integration alone would guarantee security are no longer valid. Great powers increasingly abandoning the presence of rules, using economic integration as coercion, and viewing the Arctic not as a sanctuary of low tension, but rather as a central theater of strategic competition. For Canada, this really means that we're adapting what has been called value-based realism, a posture principled in being its commitment to sovereignty, but entirely pragmatic in building the hard power necessary to defend it. So beginning with territorial sovereignty, the waters of Canada's Arctic archipelago, including the Northwest Passage, are internal waters of Canada by virtue of historic title and international law. And we're currently witnessing a climate paradox in these waters. The Arctic is warming 4 times the global average, and yet, ironically, as the ice cap shrinks, navigating the Northwest Passage is becoming more hazardous in the short term. Melting means that old multi-year ice is beginning to flow deeper into the archipelago, creating unpredictable conditions. And despite this, maritime traffic and foreign probing are increasing. Defending our sovereignty means standing unequivocally with our allies. The 2022 resolution of the Whiskey War over Hans Island, Tartu-Paluk, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark, established Canada's first land border with Europe and serves as a global model for the way peaceful resolution of international disputes can be done. But today, that solidarity is more vital than ever. The current administration in the United States has recently escalated threats with its desire to integrate and acquire Greenland, even weaponizing tariffs to silence critics. Our Prime Minister has been very, very clear. Canada stands firmly with Denmark and Greenland belongs to its people. To formalize this new relationship, Canada, on the same day as France, opened a consulate in Nuuk last month. As the ice recedes, the Arctic is emerging as a vital source of critical minerals that facilitate global energy transition. But we cannot allow adversaries to weaponize these supply chains. To ensure our collective economic security, Canada is actively forming buyers' clubs anchored in the G7 to diversify our global supply. We see the EU as an essential partner in this endeavor. We're highly vigilant regarding the explosion of foreign research, I say in quotes, vessels in the Arctic. China has declared its ambition to become a polar great power by 2030 and is regularly deploying dual-use research vessels to collect data that are shared for military means. Canada will strictly enforce our rights under the UN Charter and the Convention of the Law of the Sea that any marine scientific research in our EEZ requires our explicit consent, and we will withhold that if national security prohibits. To back this diplomacy with hard power, our generational military expansion is being done under our defense policy, Our North Strong and Free. And with our budget 2025, we're injecting nearly 82 billion Canadian dollars over 5 years to rebuild and rearm our forces. And I'm proud to state that this means that we meet our NATO commitment of 2% this year and our spending target towards 5% by 2035. To secure the Arctic, we've procured a fleet of 8 new icebreakers, and we're partnering with US and Finnish allies under the Ice Pact. And we're fast-tracking the acquisition of 12 conventionally powered, under-ice-capable submarines. Finally, we recognize that securing the North Atlantic Arctic is intrinsically linked to the European High North. A secure North America serves as the ultimate strategic rear area. And securing NATO's flanks so our European allies can focus on the East and the European Arctic. This is precisely why Canada was the first country to ratify Sweden and Finland's accession into NATO. We deeply value our bilateral partnerships. And France being an essential Tier 1 nuclear partner for Canada, we highly welcome the French Ministry of Defense, or Ministry of the Armed Forces 2025 Arctic Defense Strategy, designating the region of Greenland to Svalbard as priority area of interest. Given that our militaries are increasingly integrated, We had the French nuclear attack submarine, the Tourville, come and visit us last year. We're actively exploring the installation of ground stations on Canadian soil, complementing existing European nodes like Kiruna to increase our detection to decision time regarding our Arctic threats. In conclusion, Canada's approach is resolute. We are shedding the pleasant fictions of the past, investing massively in hard power, and locking arms with our Nordic and European allies to ensure the Arctic remains a space of stability, governed by rules and not by force. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great introduction to the topic. It just struck me that investing massively in hard power is not necessarily something we would have heard, I think, about in discussions about the region a few years ago. So the geopolitical context, and you laid this out really nicely, certainly has changed, not just for this reason, but region, but in general. But let me move to, I don't know, we're going to call it the European, the French view, Pascal. Obviously, you take this any way that you want to, but I'm really quite curious to hear how you see the kind of European role in this whole region and on the issue, especially by countries that aren't directly in the region to begin with, because of course the EU is a big country, and I don't know, Portugal and other countries aren't directly involved. So yeah, what are your thoughts on where the issues are and what the Europeans need to do, should be thinking about this, and should be doing?
Thank you, Ulrike. I will try to give a southern point of view of the high north, okay? Because EU is Brussels and France is Paris, so it is south. But beginning with the EU. The EU interest of Arctic is not coming from yesterday. The first communication was all 10 years ago, in 2016. Just to have in mind that it was just 1 year after the Paris Agreement, and it was more about climate change, global warming, and the opportunity we have with the Northwest and the Northeast passage, okay? Not only the Canadian one, but the Russian one too. And fisheries, we are some problem with EU and some Nordic states, okay? But it is a common policy of the Union, so it is the interest of the Union to speak about that. And we have a relaunch of this strategy 5 years ago. In 2021, it was more geopolitical this time. We spoke about Northern Dimension, and Northern Dimension 2021. Please remind, all that I said now is 2021. So Northern Dimension, it is EU, Iceland, Norway, and Russia. Okay? There is also the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, okay, with Russia too, because the Barents Sea is, okay. And the Arctic Council, where the Union tried to be a member, even if it is not a northern country. And of course, what's happened 1 year ago, 1 year after? A big crash, because one of the Arctic countries, Russia, invaded Ukraine. And of course, in the Arctic governance, a lot of things have changed due to that, because Russia is quite excluded from all the cooperation meeting, and there is no official meeting because of that, okay? So it is a big crash, okay? And do remind that in the Arctic countries, 5 are coming from Europe, okay? There is Canada and US too, apart Russia. But 3 are member states of the Union: Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, okay? So why this EU level is not strengthened to have a more comfortable strength due to maybe Canada or US, who are more strong countries or more big countries, okay? Why not? It is a question I have to ask, okay? The second part was the return of Donald Trump in the White House and the declaration he has of interest about Greenland, okay? And these speeches has suddenly make a solidarity between the Denmark. It was not evident at the beginning, but I do say that France was a big friend of Denmark at the time, and we have meetings with the Prime Minister and French President. There is some joint statement last January, and there is also, like you said, Canada has opened a consulate in Nuuk, but France too, okay? So it maybe it's the beginning of a new partnership, okay? And if we look at what happened, we have no new strategy of the Union about Arctic region since 2021. Lot of countries, member states or EU countries or not EU countries, have revised this strategy since Russian invasion and Donald Trump return. For example, France in 2025 has made a new defense strategy about Arctic. Germany has defined a new strategy about Arctic also. And Italy last January, 2 months ago. Okay, Italy, southern. So not Brussels, not Paris, Rome, okay? And even Norway with the Arctic countries, I've changed a lot of things because there is a defense strategy, security strategy all in May, and a North strategy in August last year. So it is very interesting to see that a lot of things have changed due to these two events, Russian invasion and Russia and in the US, because US and Russia are Arctic countries, and okay, they are not very friendly with European counterpart. And of course, EU strategy has to be updated, and it will be normally expected to come by the end of this year. You spoke about NATO because due to the Russian invasion, two neutral northern countries, your country, Mrs. Ambassador, and your neighbor of Finland, I joined NATO, who was not expecting because of the war, they were expected. Look at what's happening last week. Iceland, another Arctic country, Iceland has decided to make a partnership from defense and security with the EU. And as the Prime Minister of Iceland, I said, there will be a referendum organized next August just to see if we want to come back to the negotiation with the EU membership, because there was someone, the close one, they make a stop, and now they want to reopen that. It is a new thing of Iceland. And even Norway, and maybe it's coming to your country, Mr. Canada, because since the invasion of Russia, a lot of things have been happening in Europe about defense and security matters, mainly in the industrial program, but a new fact that it was not a competence like the fisheries, but defense is more and more on the table. And our union organized the SAFE program, and the SAFE program, Canada wants to join, and Norway too. So at the end of the day, maybe we will say, okay, you are the northern, but can we make a more strong cooperation within the union? Because the strength, the size matters against Russia, against USA, and against China, because you spoke about that, and you have to have in mind that between Russia and China, there will be some close interests in the north, okay? So we have three main, no enemies, but not people who are very friendly with us, and maybe the Arctic countries will have to make more EU involvement at the EU level and make the EU more integrated in this region for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pascal. If I may stay with you just for 1 second, because you mentioned the new Arctic strategy of the EU for the end of this year. I'm just wondering, what do you expect to be in there? Are there, also compared to, you know, the one before, are there elements that you expect to be in there and also want to be in there? You feel that this is something that needs to address? Just briefly.
I think the EU strategy has two pillars, a strategic one, maybe, and an economic one. Do not forget the economy, because of course the wishes of the president of US and maybe Russia is also because of the de-icing and the frozen of the permafrost. We need to be aware that there is some economic interest with critical raw material, and because with renewable energy, we need batteries, turbine wind, etc. So a lot of things we need to. So both pillars. But my question is, the Union is not today an actor, but is the Arctic countries from Europe want to be the Union more involved in it? So it is the wishes of the Union is to be more integrated, but do the actors, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Norway, 5, because there is only 7 Arctic states today we were working. So do they want to make the Union more influent in the cooperation and to work together, not the Union is primary, but working day-to-day negotiation. It is the main point I think we need to debate for European perspective. And as I said, I don't speak about France, but France was very involved in it. The consulate, the support of Denmark, the visit of French president in Greenland, and the visit in Paris from both the Prime Minister of Denmark and his counterpart from Greenland. So a lot of things so that it is not only the Nordic are alone, and the Southern and the France, because due to the position of France with defense and this particularity, because it is only member states of the Union to be in the Security Council of the Union to be a nuclear power army. It is very important to think about the next steps of the cooperation in the Arctic, due to the fact that US makes some speeches, Russia is in the position since 2002, and China not very far behind.
Thank you. Well, Henrik Breitenbach, you're, as I said, the Dean of the Royal Danish Defence College, and Denmark, I understand, is kind of the guest of honor of this forum, so welcome again to you. In a way, Pascal already gave you a really interesting question here, namely, as a country concerned, what role do you see and would you want for the European Union? But of course, you're very welcome to speak about all other issues as well, and I guess Greenland is particularly on Denmark's mind, but over to you.
Thank you, Ulrike. I guess I agree that Greenland, for many reasons, is on the top of mind for a lot of people. Let me just preface these remarks by saying that I'm speaking today on my own behalf, so you're not getting the Danish perspective, but a Danish perspective. And actually, rather than a Danish perspective, you get a perspective from the Kingdom of Denmark and not just the little tiny country down in the south of the overall Kingdom of Denmark. And you asked us to be lively and also brief if we could, so I'll try to combine the task of being lively and brief with also talking about constitutional issues and industrial policy and see if I succeed in that. But let me start by giving you a tiny reflection about the theme of the panel, and this was really about the geopolitics of resources in the High North, right? So there is an understanding among us all. We have an assumption that because of strategic competition and increased tensions in global politics, there will also in the High North, that will kind of spill over into the High North and result in a kind of a scramble for resources, as we have seen elsewhere. And my mission is really to perhaps to defang that assumption a little bit, with a few notable exceptions, of course. So again, and now we get to the constitutional stuff. So the Kingdom of Denmark is the parenthesis around the 3 countries of which the Kingdom of Denmark consists, namely Denmark, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland. So we have 3 different actors, and they have different roles. So the Faroe Islands and Greenland are semi-autonomous in the way that they have taken home a number of the policy areas, including natural resources. So they control the issue of natural resources and the industrial policies that follow with these. With one exception, and that is everything related to national security issues that still resides in Copenhagen. So if you want to open a uranium mine, for example, in Greenland, well, that's not just a resource issue, it's also a national security issue. So the decision-making power resides in Copenhagen. Of course, there's a bit of back and forth among the 3 constituent members about this division of labor, but that's how it is. But what I would say, though, is in agreement among all 3 members is that we are all opened for business. We're basically working on a market-based approach, and all of the 3 countries have been looking for international investments in developing those resources that visibly are there, but these are also incredibly harsh conditions. So a lot of the mining attempts that have been made, there have been tons and tons of them, but not a lot of them are going through to fruition, simply because the moment the prices rise to a level where it makes sense to extract mining resources, for example, in Greenland, well, that means that other mines in the other parts of the world, for example, Australia, will reopen. So we're caught in a paradox here where the economic case for having very large resource extraction in a part of the globe where the conditions are extremely harsh and unwelcoming large parts of the year just makes the economic case really hard. So seen from both Copenhagen, from Nuuk and from Tórshavn, I think all of the 3 governments would welcome many more private investments. So looking at this from the regular point of view of the markets and not from the geopolitical perspective of kind of sinister motives, the door is wide open. So there's really no reason to try to enter another door because the regular door is already wide open. And that was the asterisk I mentioned. Of course, for specifically 2 governments, I would guess, and this is where again I just speak as myself, but I think it's not unreasonable to guess that investments by Chinese actors or Russian actors would not be welcome in, for example, Greenland, and would be deemed a national security issue in both Nuuk and Copenhagen, and the same way in Tórshavn. And then of course there is the issue, as we have seen this year, with the Trump administration and Greenland. But I find that to be outside of the normal parable of everything. Everything is actually set up for including American capital to come in and invest in Greenland. And I think everybody's looking forward to the situation moving forward in a hopefully calmer manner. Thank you.
Okay, but picking up on that point, how does this work? How can we or the Greenlander or Denmark on the one hand say we welcome investment by US companies, while at the same time being threatened very openly? I mean, this wasn't veiled, this was very clear threat of at some point even military intervention, but certainly just kind of annexation by the US government. Like, how do you square that circle? Especially because, I mean, I'm sure the people here in this room have seen recent reporting by Danish newspapers on the European presence, the European military presence on Greenland just after the Trump statements. And you may all remember that the Europeans sent troops, I mean, small numbers, right? Small numbers of troops to Greenland. At the time, it was sold primarily to the wider audience as a kind of show of force, of the willingness of Europeans to defend Greenland against, actors such as Russia and China, which is the actors that Donald Trump and others had mentioned as kind of threatening Greenland. But it turns out, I mean, this was already the rumor, the debate at that point, but now with the reporting from Danish newspapers, we know this more clearly. It turns out that these troops were quite seriously also considering the possibility of an actual US military landing and annexation effort in Greenland, something that seems to all of us absolutely absurd, and yet here we are. So how do you square that circle? Can we kind of divide the resource, the economic aspects into geopolitical one, and just kind of on the one side continue business as usual, and on the other just kind of hope that we won't see a shooting war over Greenland? How do you think about that?
I acknowledge the newspaper front pages, but I also think that we have to understand that geopolitics, the perspective of geopolitics works in the very, very long term, and we have to think in installments of 50 years at a time. And relationship not between individuals, but between states that will be there once all of us are gone. And once we are all gone, there will still be a relationship between Europe and the United States. There will still be a relationship between Denmark and the United States, and I think this is also the grown-up approach to handling these kinds of things is a grounded pragmatism, and I also think that the logic of Arctic cooperative politics has been very strong so far, and with the exception of the relationship of Russia, there's actually been relationship to Russia. There's been an opportunity to cooperate in the Arctic affairs among the Arctic peoples, including the indigenous people. And I think all of the governments should be supportive of that kind of politics and not give up on that just because of the current crisis. I think that's the grown-up approach.
Thank you very much. I want to say this is already a rather diplomatic view, if you like, even though you're not a diplomat, but you have a diplomat sitting right next to you. So let's come to Caroline Vicini, the ambassador of Sweden to France, and hear about the Swedish view. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us and for giving your time to us. And over to you.
Thank you. My pleasure, really. So Sweden is an Arctic state, but we have only a very small part of our territory in the Arctic, and we have no Arctic coastline. But we are members of the Arctic Council that was mentioned before, and we consider ourselves an Arctic country. The growing link between the Arctic and the Baltic region has a very strategic importance for us. And Swedish air bases and infrastructure will play key roles. And our centrally placed geography is a strategic asset by itself. Northern Sweden is also a strategic resource for Europe beyond the military dimension. Anyone who has been in Sweden knows that Sweden is a very long country, and the southern part is really where most of our population is concentrated, and then you have the northern part, which is almost 2/3, I would say, of the country, considered how we see it, and with much less people. But we have two of the world's largest underground iron ore mines lying in north of the Arctic Circle. And Sweden accounts for about 87% of all iron ore extraction in the EU. Northern Sweden also has a major potential for rare earth production. We have a deposit called Pergeir also in Kiruna, beside one of the large mines, that could eventually supply almost 20% of Europe's demand. Energy is another factor, and we have seen that in Ukraine now, in the war in Ukraine. Sweden is the EU's largest electricity exporter, and 40% of our electricity comes from the northern hydropower. Our rivers and dams and energy infrastructure are strategic assets of the High North. And as the Nordic and Canadian Prime Ministers stated recently in Oslo, we are committed to Arctic security and to ensuring that people who live in our part of the world can prosper in peace. And that has been it was mentioned before by my Canadian colleague here, a peaceful and low tension High North was for a very long time the ambition we all had. This today naturally includes supporting NATO's strength and presence in the High North, improving both deterrence and defense. And in this context, and I say that as we are in Paris and as I'm the ambassador to France, France's contribution has been very much appreciated, such as last year's Pegasus Grand Nord exercise, where the French Air Force made major deployments to the Luleå Air Base. And we know that France has now also been a part of the Cold Response 26, which is a huge exercise in the northern part of Europe. 2 years after joining NATO, Sweden is already a very active ally. Our armed forces are technologically advanced, and we contribute to integrated capabilities across most domains. We have troops in Latvia and a leading role in the forward land forces in Finland, where also France participates. And we are strongly committed to Baltic Sea security through NATO's Baltic Sentry operation. As mentioned, geography remains a key contribution. With Sweden and Finland in NATO, all Baltic Sea states, except Russia, are now allies. NATO has gained a longer land border with Russia and a more coherent operational area in the Northern Europe. The alliance now also has a continuous eastern flank from the European Arctic to the Mediterranean via the Black Sea. And NATO's operational depth has increased. In the High North, the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea region that are indeed much more connected these days. To some extent, the war in Ukraine means that Russia's military capability elsewhere is temporarily limited. And this is a clear example of how Ukraine de facto defending all of us. These limitations apply mainly to large-scale operations in the short term. But we also see that the traffic out of the koala bases are continuing almost as before, under the water and in the sea. But Russia has also increased its military production and shows a high level of political and military risk-taking. It retains the ability to conduct air, naval, long-range, and even nuclear operations against Sweden and our neighbors, and we must be prepared for that. In Sweden's and Finland's and Norway's vicinity, as we don't have Norway and Finland here, I speak on their behalf, Russia plans a new army corps and several new divisions near St. Petersburg, as well as a new air regiment on the Koala Peninsula, where we already have these deep-sea harbors and the submarine harbors. It's also continuing its military buildup in the wider Arctic region. So for Sweden, it's clear that Europe must raise its readiness for long-term confrontation. This requires increased cooperation in the Nordic-Baltic region, as well as across the continent. And in this process, we are seeing the High North moving from the periphery to the center of attention, or being, as somebody who brought me in here said, this used to be a niche topic, and now we are in the biggest room of this school. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I also noted this. I don't know whether there's an Iran debate going on in parallel, so maybe they would have wanted the big room otherwise. But I also thought that was very interesting that we got the big room. Thank you so much for that. Last but not least, we've got, am I allowed to call it the French view? David Béard from CAP, so the Foreign Ministry of France, and we've already heard a lot of very nice things about the French involvement and engagement in the region from our previous speakers. And maybe you can indeed address this. So what, and to kind of put it very bluntly, what are France's interests in the region? Why is there an increased engagement? Is this geopolitical primarily? Is this economic? Yeah, and how do you see the current issues that we just discussed? Thanks.
Thank you. An honor to be here in a almost all Nordic panel. I used to be personally posted in Stockholm, and it's a region that is dear to my heart. Also the fact that Denmark is the partner country for this year's forum is not a coincidence. And this is obviously a very important and timely topic. Usual caveat to say that I represent the policy planning staff, and as such I don't represent the official French position, but for this topic in particular, the Arctic region in general is one of the main topics for strategic planning. It's a region we've been working on for years because it encapsulates many of the challenges we're looking at in terms of maritime routes, in terms of nuclear deterrence, in terms of European sovereignty. I will come back to this, in terms also of consequences of climate change, and in terms of big power competition. You can also add, I will also come back quickly to this, but challenges related to outer space, because the poles, of course, are in a peculiar situation when it comes to the capabilities that are needed for early warning systems, for example. That being said, I wanted to dwell on 3 points. One on European sovereignty and why France also considers that the Arctic region is so strategic. Second, on big power competition in the Arctic region and why this is also a big part of what we call burden sharing with the US, and how the role that Nordic countries and Europe plays in the Arctic region is enshrined in the burden sharing agreement that we have with the US. And third, how we need kind of a long-term vision about the resources of the High North that has to take into account the environmental impacts of what exploitation of these resources would mean. So first, in terms of European sovereignty, clearly the Arctic region is a major pillar of European sovereignty. We are now in the process of mapping our vulnerabilities as Europeans, again, in terms of critical raw minerals, of supply chains, of strategic goods, also energy-wise. And the Arctic region there is more of a region we look at for the next 20 to 30 years, with, again, the northern route slowly opening, although it's still, we're not only talking about a few boats at this stage. And for France, it's been part of our strategies that the Arctic region is key if we want to achieve this European sovereignty. So we already mentioned the visit of President Macron to Nuuk in June 25, the visit of Minister Barrot also to Greenland in August 25, the opening of the French consulate in February last month, but also the fact that our carrier strike group went to the region recently, and that France is contributing to the mapping of natural resources in Greenland through our specific bureau called the BRGM. Then our attachment when it comes to the crisis that we had to go through in January, there for France it had a specific importance, also because of the historical ties we have with the militaries of the Nordic region, not only in the north, but also, I mean, we've been fighting along Danish or Swedish special forces in the Sahel and in different fields, in different theaters. And for us, Greenland's sovereignty is something, we are attached to this sovereignty in the same way we are attached to any territory of EU member states. And in January, France signaled very clearly its readiness to defend Greenland from any outside threat. So when the crisis arose, of course, we were expecting solidarity among Nordic countries, which is something that I would say is a given, given how close they are in terms of military cooperation. But it was very important that the EU response would be also united and efficient. And through the threat of reinstating tariffs, through the threat of activating the anti-coercion agreement, in addition to the Danish outreach efforts in the US, have achieved de-escalation at this stage. This doesn't mean that the crisis is fully behind us, and we have to remain very vigilant. But I would say that one of the arguments that the Danes have laid forward, which was the idea that if there would be an annexation or a military offensive from the part of the US, it would be the end of NATO and the end of the transatlantic alliance. And I think it's true, and I think it's been heard, at least in some parts of the US apparatus. Second point I wanted to make quickly was, although we've already dwelled on it, is the military buildup and the big power competition in the region. Of course, this is a lot about exploiting future maritime routes with icebreakers in the region, and also this region, of course, has been a priority for Russia for a long time in terms of the role it plays for its own naval and nuclear bases. It's been also a region where we witness increased military, not only economic, but also military cooperation between Russia and China. And it is also a region that had been not abandoned, but where the US involvement had been less important in recent decades, but now there are important capability developments planned in the US that are related to US security, that are directly related to the high north in terms of radars, naval surveillance, polar intervention capacity, and also, as I mentioned, outer space dimension through the project of the Golden Dome. Now, for Europeans also, of course, the security of the region is key. Of course, there is the GUK gap that I think we mentioned, this gap between Greenland and Iceland and between Iceland and the UK, which has always been under close scrutiny to prevent the Russian North Fleet and the Russian nuclear submarines to access the North Atlantic. And in the burden sharing, in the development of the burden sharing between the US and Europe, it's been clear that most of the capabilities are Canadian, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, French to a certain extent, and this is where the alliance has invested its capabilities when it comes to the high north. And this is why this burden sharing logic between the US and Europe should be further developed, and that we need as Europeans to show that we are concretely involved in the region. And the last point I wanted to make is about global climate and international scientific cooperation when it comes to the natural resources of the region. Of course, the access to these resources is an important source of geopolitical tensions. But as mentioned before, exploiting these resources would question the preservation of a space which is key to climate stability. Also, the fact that climate change and security cannot be separated; they are intertwined. And because of this, we need to have a specific discussion on these resources and whether we want to exploit it or not. And I think as Europeans, of course, with the leading role of the regional powers, but we have to be able to develop a long-term vision of how to approach these resources and to take into account not only the environmental impacts of potentially exploiting it, but also the impacts it can have on the indigenous people's environment.
Thank you so much, especially for kind of drawing out the geopolitical and power competition elements of the region again. And maybe we can come back to that again, because I think it's really highly relevant. Henrik wanted to come in. I already tell you to prepare questions if you have them. I think it would be lovely to hear a bit more from the audience. I believe we have microphones that can be passed through the ranks. But Henrik, you wanted to add something.
The Arctic geopolitics of climate change. And you spoke a little bit to it now in the end. And I think everyone who's in the room, I assume, are national security professionals in the sense that they work with threats and risks and so on. And we try to figure out where things might go wrong. And we have all been trained to think about climate change in a very specific way, namely that climate change is bad for national security or for security issues, because it erodes institutions and creates fragility, which will then lead to problems that we will have to solve with national security means, sometimes military, sometimes other. But in the Arctic case, that's not really true, because all of the states that are in the Arctic space, which is very, very empty, all of the states that are there are strong and capable states. They have a strong capacity to act. This is not sub-Saharan Africa. To the extent that there are indigenous people, they are part of these strong states and have good relations with them. So actually, climate change is a game changer in the Arctic, but not immediately in a bad way. If you ask some of the indigenous people, they will look at it rather differently than, say, some of the sub-Saharan representatives would at a UN assembly, because what thawing ice does is actually it opens up for traffic. And what does traffic do? Well, it enables you to make money and be rich and live peacefully in a good way. So actually, climate change to begin with in the Arctic is not a harbinger of coming war, but rather an opening up that can result in economic prosperity and cooperation. And if you look at, for example, and I'm being a little bit provocative here, but I mean this, if you look at the Russian activities along their perimeter, and they kind of have control with half of the Arctic Ocean, well, a lot of that can be explained by the fact that they also want to extract resources from that area, either directly from drilling or mining, or because they want to earn money in the longer run from being able to shepherding traffic through the Arctic. So when we talk about the shipping lines, for example, now Denmark has one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, and they have been sailing, the Maersk Corporation have been sailing ships through the Arctic next to Russia. And the thing is, if we start having an actual traffic between Europe and the Pacific through the Arctic, if that did happen to have a commercial impact, well, how would that spur conflict and war? Wouldn't it actually if the Russians were making money on safeguarding these ships, wouldn't it actually give us all a stake in having a responsible economic development of the Arctic? So I think our assumption that climate change will lead to conflict is wrong in the Arctic case. And I think to a very large extent, we're looking, again, as I talked about before, we're looking at, with the exception of some irrational actors, in the very long term, there's good prosperity, good possibility that the Arctic can be a space for peaceful cooperation and mutual trade.
Fantastic. I mean, it is so rare in the discussions that I'm usually part of to hear kind of a positive spin on things, and I certainly haven't been, I think, in anywhere there was a positive spin on climate change. But your point is well taken, that in this region the situation may look slightly different than in the rest of the world. Turning to the audience, was that a hand raise over there? Yeah, exactly. I can already see a few hands, so I'll pause my questions for a moment and maybe go to the audience right away. Do we have microphones?